Take a moment to settle in. Let the day behind you grow distant. Tonight we are going to spend some time in the past, not in its courts or its cathedrals, but in its smallest, quietest spaces. We are going to sit inside the homes of ordinary people in the deep cold of a medieval winter, during one of the most difficult periods the human world has ever known. This is not a story told for drama. It is told slowly, the way the season itself moved, day by day, fire by fire, breath by breath. There were families in 14th century Europe who endured winters of extraordinary severity, while a disease moved through their towns and villages at a pace they could neither predict nor explain. They did not have the language we have now for what was happening. What they had was a hearth, a roof, a store of salted meat, and each other. We will move through one of those winters together. We will look at the homes people built, the fires they kept, the food they preserved, the way they divided the long night into something manageable. We will look at how the cold and the sickness met inside the very spaces designed to keep people safe. So let yourself settle. The story will unfold at its own pace. In the 14th century, winter was not a season to be endured from behind glass. It arrived in full force, dropping temperatures across the continent for months at a time, freezing the rivers that served as trade routes, burying the fields under weeks of frost, and shortening the hours of daylight until northern villages lived in near constant darkness. For the peasant population of Europe, this was already a familiar hardship. The seasonal cycle had always imposed a kind of annual reckoning. The harvest had to feed the household through to the following spring, the firewood had to be gathered and stacked before the ground hardened, and the animals had to be secured before the first deep freeze. These were not preparations made in anxiety. They were the steady rhythms of a life shaped entirely by the turning of the year. But beginning in 1347, those familiar winters carried something new with them. The plague had arrived in Sicily aboard trading ships from the Black Sea, and over the following months it traveled inland with a speed that bewildered those who witnessed it. By 1348 it had moved into France, the Iberian Peninsula, and the Italian city-states. By 1349 it had crossed the Channel into England and continued north into Scandinavia. By 1350 it had reached Poland and the Baltic coast. What the people of the time could not have known in time, and what took centuries to understand, was that the disease traveled in more than one form. The most familiar form, bubonic plague, produced the swollen lymph nodes, or buboes, that gave the disease its name. It moved primarily through the bites of fleas carried by the black rat. In warmer months and warmer climates, this form dominated, but the winter brought a different pattern. As temperatures dropped, the rat flea, the primary carrier of the disease, became less active. Modern epidemiology tells us that the flea's ability to transmit the bacteria is impaired when temperatures fall significantly below 10 degrees Celsius. By those calculations, the plague should have slowed or even paused in the deep winters of northern Europe. But the historical record shows something else entirely. In Trondheim, along the western coast of Norway, burial records show plague deaths peaking in February. In the trading city of Lübeck on the Baltic coast of northern Germany, consistent spikes appear in late October and November. January outbreaks were documented in Scotland and in Sweden. These were not warm environments. In January, Trondheim averaged temperatures well below freezing. The rat flea would have been dormant, yet the disease persisted. This contradiction has occupied researchers for generations. The working explanation that has gained the most traction in recent decades involves two related factors. The first is that winter conditions favored a different form of the disease. Pneumonic plague, the respiratory form, spread through the air, passed from person to person through the droplets of a cough or a shared breath. It did not require a flea. It required only proximity, and winter, with its sealed homes and crowded rooms, provided that in abundance. The second factor involves the parasites that lived not on rats, but on people. The human flea and the body louse were common presences in 14th century households. Unlike the rat flea, these insects lived inside clothing and bedding, sheltered by the warmth of the human body. In a winter when heavy wool garments were worn continuously and rarely washed, and when families shared a single bed for warmth, These parasites moved easily between people, carrying the bacteria with them regardless of the temperature outside. The plague, in other words, adapted to the winter. It shifted its method of travel to suit the environment, finding its way through the cold months not by waiting, but by changing. This is the context in which the ordinary household of the 14th century tried to survive. Not simply against the cold, which was already demanding enough, but against a disease that used the cold as cover. The home that was designed to trap warmth also trapped breath. The bed that kept a family from freezing also brought them into the closest possible contact. The very logic of winter survival. Stay inside, stay together, stay warm, aligned in this period with the logic of contagion. Understanding how people endured this requires us to move inside those homes and look carefully at what was there. How the walls were built, how the fire was managed, how the night was organized, and how the daily work of staying alive continued even as the disease moved through the village beyond the door. Most of the people who lived through the Black Death winters did not live in stone castles or timber frame merchants' houses. They lived in structures that historians now call cruck houses, low curved frame buildings made from materials gathered from the immediate landscape. To describe these homes as simple would be accurate, but it would miss something important. They were not crude shelters built in ignorance. They were carefully designed responses to the climate, shaped by generations of accumulated knowledge about what kept warmth inside a building and cold out of it. The frame of a cruck house was formed from pairs of curved timber beams, usually taken from naturally bent tree trunks, that met at the ridge of the roof and were anchored to the ground. This curved structure distributed the weight of the roof along the full length of the building, which meant the walls did not have to bear the structural load. The walls could therefore be built from lighter, more accessible materials. The most common wall material was wattle and daub. Thin branches were woven between upright stakes to create a flexible lattice, the wattle. This lattice was then packed on both sides with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and often animal dung, pressed in and smoothed until it formed a solid surface. The daub. When dried, this composite material had a quality that made it particularly well suited to cold climates, high thermal mass. It absorbed heat slowly during the hours when the fire was burning and released it slowly through the hours of the night. A well-made wattle and daub wall did not simply block the cold, it stored warmth and returned it gradually to the room. The roof was thatch, dense layers of reeds or straw packed tightly enough to shed rain and snow. Thatch has natural insulating properties. Air is trapped within the fibers, and it slows the movement of heat from the warm interior of the house to the cold air above. A thatched roof in good repair acted as a thermal lid, preventing the warmth that rose from the hearth from escaping through convection. Maintaining the thatch was a seasonal task. Before winter, households checked for gaps and damaged sections, repacking them with fresh material. The floor was typically beaten earth, which is a poor insulator and draws heat from anything resting on it. To counter this, the floor was covered with rushes, the long-stemmed plants that grew in abundance along riverbanks, spread in thick layers across the living space. Rushes packed together trap pockets of air in the same way that thatch does, creating a layer of thermal resistance between the cold ground and the feet of the people living above it. Over time, these rush coverings accumulated organic matter, food scraps, ash, animal droppings, and were periodically swept out and replaced with fresh material. The smell of a well-used rush floor was particular and pervasive, a blend of dried vegetation, smoke, and the faint sourness of decomposition. The windows, where they existed at all, were small. That's sec, deliberately so. Glass was expensive and largely unavailable to the peasant household. Windows were instead covered during winter with wooden shutters that could be closed and latched against the night air. Some households hung heavy wool cloth across the openings. In wealthier peasant homes, small panes of paper soaked in oil or mortar were fitted into the window frames, allowing a pale, diffused light to enter while blocking the draft. Archaeological records from southern France indicate that even some church windows were sealed with mortar during particularly severe winters. In the colder regions of Germany and the Alpine territories, a further refinement was common: the Stube. This was a small paneled inner room built within the larger structure of the house. Because it was smaller, it was easier to heat to a livable temperature. In households where the main room might remain barely above freezing on the coldest nights, the stuba served as a sanctuary, a room where the temperature could be raised enough for sleeping infants or the very old. The paneling also reduced drafts by creating another layer of separation between the living space and the outer walls. What these homes shared, across their regional variations, was a logic of accumulation. No single feature was sufficient. The walls alone could not hold enough heat without the roof. The roof alone could not prevent cold without the sealed windows. The sealed windows trapped air that the floor covering then kept from chilling through contact with the ground. Each element supported the others, and the result was a building that, in the depth of a medieval winter, could maintain a livable temperature with the help of a single central fire. The limitation of this design was also its danger. The same closure that preserved warmth prevented the circulation of air. A 14th century home in January was an environment of profound stillness. The same air breathed and rebreathed, the same space, shared for every hour of the day and night. Smoke from the fire hung in the upper part of the room and seeped slowly through the thatch rather than rising through a chimney. The open central hearth, with no flue to carry combustion gases away, filled the interior with a low, constant haze. For most of the year, this was a manageable inconvenience. In winter, it was the price of survival. And in the winters of the plague years, it was also one of the conditions that allowed the disease to move most freely. The shared breath, the shared air, the sealed room that kept the family warm and kept the infection circulating among them. The house that protected its inhabitants from the cold was also, in those years, a space that needed to be understood as carefully as the disease itself. The people who built and maintained these homes did not know this. They knew only that the cold was outside, and that the fire and the walls and the layered floor stood between their family and a death that was, in winter, almost as certain as the plague itself. At the center of the medieval home, on a flat base of stone or brick set directly on the floor of the main room, the hearth fire burned. There was no chimney in most peasant homes of this period. The fire sat open to the room, its smoke finding its own way upward through the darkness of the rafters and out through a gap or a smoke hole in the thatch above. The fire was not a background feature of the house. It was the house's reason for functioning. Everything that sustained life in the winter months converged on that stone base. The family gathered around it for warmth, close enough to feel the direct radiation of its heat. Pots of pottage and broth were suspended over it on iron hooks or set among the embers in clay vessels. Wet clothing was draped near it to dry. The tallow dip, a simple length of rush coated in animal fat, was lit from it each evening to provide the household's only artificial light. In a room without windows that admitted significant daylight, the fire was the source of light as well as heat, and the amber glow it cast across the wattle and daub walls was the characteristic visual world of the medieval winter interior. Managing the fire required knowledge and discipline. Wood was a regulated resource in the medieval countryside. The forests of England, France, and Germany were not open commons available for anyone to enter and cut. They were maintained under the authority of the lord of the manor, protected by an official called the woodward, whose role was to enforce the rules governing what could be taken and what could not. A peasant household had the right to gather fallen branches, broken wood, and brushwood blown down by the wind, a right known as cableish. Green timber, standing wood, and larger branches were reserved for the lord's own use. In practical terms, this meant that the fuel available to a typical household was the least efficient kind, small diameter. Branches, dead wood softened by moisture, and compressed bundles of reed and straw. These materials burned quickly, generated relatively little sustained heat, and required constant tending. Keeping a fire going through a 14-hour winter night on such fuel demanded planning. Women and older children were regularly tasked with gathering the day's supply, dragging bundles across frozen fields and through ice-hardened mud, and the work was, by any measure, exhausting. The technique developed across generations to manage this limitation was the banked fire. Before sleeping, The household drew the embers together into a tight mound at the center of the hearth and covered them with a thick layer of ash. The ash acted as insulation, allowing the core of the embers to remain alive at low heat through the night without requiring fresh fuel. In the morning or during the midnight watch, the ash could be swept back to reveal the glowing core, and fresh wood laid on top of it would catch quickly. This practice was efficient, but it also meant that the fire at night was not truly burning. It was smoldering. The heat output during the banked hours was lower than during the day, and the household temperature in the hours before dawn would have dropped significantly, particularly in the parts of the room furthest from the hearth. This is one reason the communal sleeping arrangements of the period were not merely a social custom, but a thermal necessity. The warmth of other bodies in a shared bed compensated for the diminished output of the banked fire. Beyond its practical function, the fire held a deep place in the symbolic life of the medieval household. In Anglo-Saxon tradition, and in the folk belief that persisted through the medieval period, the hearth fire was considered sacred, not in a formally religious sense, but in the older sense of something that must be protected because its continuity meant the continuity of the family. Letting the fire go out entirely was considered a bad sign, an omen of misfortune, a failure of the household's vigilance against the dangers that the darkness carried. It was not merely inconvenient to wake to a cold hearth. It was, in the folk understanding of the time, a small rupture in the domestic order. In the plague years, this symbolic weight deepened. When death was moving through the village, when a neighbor's house had fallen silent, when the parish bells rang more often than they should, the maintenance of the fire was an act that carried meaning beyond the practical. It was evidence that the household was still alive, that the family had made it through the night. That warmth, in both the physical and the familial sense, persisted. The smoke that the fire produced was a constant presence. A 14th century home in winter smelled of wood smoke in every corner, in every fiber of the clothing and the bedding, in the hair of everyone who slept there. This was known, and it was accepted. What was not understood at the time was that the smoke produced a secondary effect of some significance. The black rat, the primary host of the flea that carried bubonic plague, avoided environments with high smoke concentrations. A home with a persistently smoking hearth was, accidentally, a less hospitable environment for the rat and its parasites than a cold, unoccupied building. This did not protect against the pneumonic form of the disease, which needed no rat and no flea, but it may have offered some partial defense against flea-borne transmission during the seasons when that form of transmission was active. The household fire, in this sense, provided more layers of protection than those who maintained it could have known. The fire needed to be fed through the night. Someone had to wake and tend it. This fact was not separable from the rhythm of sleep itself, and it helps explain why the medieval night was divided the way it was, not into a single long rest, but into two distinct phases of sleep with a waking interval between them during which the fire was checked, the embers were turned, and the house was held together against the dark. The night in 14th century Europe was not the same thing the modern world understands by that word. For most people in the industrialized present, night is a pause, an interval of darkness during which the world continues largely as before, lit from within, active at the edges, and managed by the expectation of a single, unbroken sleep. For the medieval peasant in the depths of January, night was an event in its own right, beginning not long after sunset and lasting until sunrise some 10 or 12, or in the northernmost latitudes, 16 hours later. The first response to darkness was retreat. With no means of generating light beyond the small radius of the fire and the short-lived flicker of a tallow rush, the workable world contracted sharply at dusk. Fields, barns, roads, and markets ceased to exist in any meaningful, practical sense. The household turned inward, drawing together around the hearth, and the hours between sunset and sleep were occupied with the modest tasks that could be performed in low light: mending, spinning, the quieter forms of tool maintenance, the recounting of the day's small events. Sleep began early. In most households, the family retired for what was known in French as the premier somme, the first sleep. Shortly after full darkness had settled, typically somewhere around 8 in the evening. This was not a choice made from preference. The darkness made staying awake costly. Fuel for fire was rationed. Candles and rushes were consumed faster with each additional hour. The body, after the physical labor of a winter day, hauling wood, feeding animals, maintaining a structure against the cold, was ready for rest well before the modern hour of midnight. The first sleep lasted approximately 4 hours. Around midnight, the household would naturally wake. This waking was not the disorientation of modern insomnia, the unwelcome surfacing from a sleep that should have continued. Medieval and early modern accounts describe it as a composed interval, a natural break between two distinct periods of rest, expected and even used. This pattern of sleep is now sometimes called biphasic or segmented sleep. The historian Roger E. Kirch, who spent decades studying pre-industrial sleep practices, identified references to it across hundreds of historical documents. Diaries, medical texts, court records, and literary accounts in French, English, Latin, and Italian. The first sleep and the second sleep were distinct categories, each with its own name, its own character, and its own understood purpose. The interval between them was similarly named, the watch. During the watch, the household was neither fully awake nor asleep. Accounts describe a state of quiet alertness, different from the sharpness of a full waking day. The fire was the first concern. Whoever woke first would check the embers, move the ash, and add fresh wood to ensure the house remained warm through the final hours before dawn. This was not a small matter. In a winter, where temperatures outside the door might fall well below freezing, a fire that went cold in the hours before dawn meant a household waking to a room that had lost much of its accumulated warmth. Clothing that had to be pulled on in the cold, a kettle that could not be heated, a morning that began in discomfort rather than the manageable routine the household depended on. Religious observance was common during the watch. The monastic tradition of waking at midnight for the office of matins, the first prayer of the liturgical day, had filtered into lay practice over centuries. For ordinary people during the plague years, the midnight hour carried particular spiritual weight. The plague was understood as a punishment from God or as a visitation of divine wrath that could be turned aside through sufficient prayer and penance. To wake in the middle of the night and direct one's attention toward heaven was, in this understanding, not merely pious habit, but a form of active defense. The plague saints, Saint Roche and Saint Sebastian, were invoked during these hours. Small devotional images hung on the walls of homes near the fire. Brief prayers written on paper and sewn into cloth pouches were worn around the neck, especially on children. The watch also served as a moment for the quieter work of the hands. Baskets were woven, small implements were repaired, wool was spun in the firelight. These were tasks that required some attention, but not the full concentration of daylight hours. They filled the waking interval with purpose rather than anxiety, and they produced the modest household goods, the woven containers, the mended tools that kept the domestic economy functioning through the months when outdoor work was not possible. Then came the second sleep. This phase, which lasted from roughly 2 in the morning until dawn, was characterized by lighter rest. Medieval and early modern accounts associate the second sleep with more active dreaming, a quality of sleep closer to the surface, more easily disturbed, but also richer in the kind of imagery that people of the time took seriously as communication from the divine or the dead. Dreams during the plague years were recorded with unusual frequency, their content often involving the plague saints, angelic figures, or visions of the dead. These dreams were not simply the product of anxiety, though anxiety was certainly present. They reflected the particular quality of the second sleep, which modern sleep research has associated with the stages of sleep richest in REM activity. The structure of the medieval night, the early retirement, the first sleep, the quiet watch, the second sleep, the slow return of morning, was not arbitrary. It was a response to the length of the winter darkness, the cost of artificial light, the requirements of fire maintenance, and the rhythms of a body shaped by a world without electric illumination. It was, in its own way, an efficient system, one that distributed the demands of the night across its available hours, rather than compressing them into a single period of unconsciousness. In the plague winters, this structure took on additional significance. The watch became a time when the sounds of the village could be listened to, and when the silence of a household that had been active the day before could be noticed. When there were no lights visible in a neighbor's window, when the dogs were quiet in a way that was not the quiet of sleep, when the church bells rang at unusual hours, the watch provided a moment of attention in which the household could read the world around them and assess what the night was bringing. The medieval bed in the household of a peasant family was a communal space. This is one of the most consistently documented features of domestic life in the 14th century, and it was true across regions and economic circumstances. Husbands and wives shared a bed as a matter of course. Children slept alongside parents. Servants, where households employed them, slept in the same room and often in the same bed as their employers. Travelers who sought lodging at an inn might find themselves assigned a berth beside a stranger without any expectation of objection or apology. The practice had a vernacular name in English, to pig, meaning to share a sleeping space, as livestock share a pen. The reasons for this practice were not primarily social, they were thermal. A medieval peasant home at 2 a.m, with the hearth banked and the temperature outside below freezing, was a space where the distance from the fire measured the difference between reasonable warmth and genuine cold. The parts of the room closest to the hearth retained heat reasonably well. The far corners, near the sealed windows and the outer walls, were significantly colder. The sleeping space, wherever it was located within the room, depended on the bodies within it to supplement the diminishing warmth of the fire. The physics of this arrangement are straightforward. An adult human body generates heat continuously, releasing it through the skin into the immediate surrounding space. A bed shared by 2 adults produces roughly twice that heat output within the enclosed space under the blankets. A family of 4 or 5 generates a microclimate within the bed that can be substantially warmer than the ambient temperature of the room. In a space where the ambient temperature in the hours before dawn might drop to levels that posed a genuine risk of hypothermia, particularly for infants, the elderly, and those weakened by illness. This shared warmth was not a comfort, but a necessity. The bed itself was designed to hold that warmth. The base was typically a wooden frame strung with ropes to form a flexible surface. On top of this lay a straw-filled mattress, a coarse sack stuffed with dried straw or chaff that provided cushioning, and also a degree of insulation between the sleeper and the wooden frame below. Wealthier households might replace the straw with wool or feathers, producing the feather bed that appears as a valued possession in wills and inventories of the period. Over the sleepers lay blankets of coarse wool and often the household's heaviest outdoor cloaks, which were folded over the bed as additional layers when the night was particularly cold. The wool blankets deserve a specific mention because wool, unlike linen or cotton, retains its insulating properties when damp. In a room where breath condensed in the air and the walls might be cool enough to collect moisture, sleeping under damp wool was still warmer than sleeping without it. This characteristic made wool the dominant textile of the medieval winter across all social levels, in clothing as well as bedding. In the months of plague, the communal bed became one of the disease's most efficient pathways. The body louse lived in clothing and bedding, feeding on human blood and moving between hosts whenever they came into contact. In a shared bed, a louse on one person had easy access to every other person in that bed. If the louse carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague, it carried it into contact with every sleeper in the household over the course of a single night. The human flea operated by similar logic, moving between sleeping bodies in the enclosed warmth beneath the blankets. Historical accounts return repeatedly to the observation that entire households died together or within days of each other. Contemporary chroniclers attributed this to the corrupting influence of proximity to the sick. The miasmatic theory that poisonous vapors emanated from the bodies of the dying and infected those nearby, in the mnemonic form of the plague. This attribution was not entirely wrong. Respiratory droplets did carry the infection. But the pattern of simultaneous household deaths is also consistent with vector-borne transmission through shared bedding, where the parasites moved among sleeping bodies with no barrier to stop them. The people in those beds had no mechanism for understanding what was happening at the level of the parasite. What they could observe was the pattern. A household that slept together often died together. Some of the wealthier households in plague literature, and the merchant families described in Boccaccio's Decameron, for instance, responded by separating, relocating to country estates, limiting contact with those who were ill. For the peasant family without a second property or the means to leave, no such strategy was available. The shared bed was not a choice that could be set aside. It was a structural feature of the winter household, as necessary as the fire or the sealed walls. There is another dimension to the shared bed that the historical record preserves alongside the epidemiology. It was a space of intimacy, not only in the physical sense, but in the quieter sense of proximity over time. In a household where the waking hours were divided between outdoor labor and communal work, where privacy was an entirely foreign concept, the long night in the shared bed was one of the few spaces in which people existed alongside each other without the structure of task or role. Conversations happened there, in the dark, in the quiet of the watch. Children were held. The old were kept warm by the young. The sick were tended by those who slept beside them and reached across in the night to check whether warmth was still present. This proximity is documented in the practical literature of the period, in the instructions given by physicians for the care of plague victims, which acknowledged that family members would not leave the bedside, and in the devotional literature, which treats the care of the sick in their beds as a form of religious duty, even at risk of one's own life. The shared bed was a space of danger, and the people who slept in it knew that danger in a vague, experiential way. Even if they could not name its mechanism, they stayed anyway. The winter required it. The family required it. The cold, in that sense, was more immediate than the disease. Outside, the village lay under whatever the season had delivered, frost or mud or snow that muffled sound and reduced the visible world to the small circle of what the dawn light could reach. Inside, the household lay together under its wool blankets, the banked fire holding its warmth, the thatched roof settling above them, the walls releasing the last of the day's stored heat into the quiet air of the room. This was the medieval winter in its most fundamental form, a small, warm space held together against the cold by the accumulated effort of every person within it. The medieval peasant did not enter winter hoping to eat well. The expectations were set long before the first frost arrived. Summer and autumn were the seasons of production, the grain harvested, the animals fattened on open pasture, the root vegetables pulled, and the orchard stripped. Winter was the season of consumption, governed entirely by how well the household had managed those earlier months. A family that had stored enough would survive in reasonable health. A family that had not would find the weeks between January and April the most dangerous of the year. The term used in the historical record for the lean weeks of late winter is the hunger gap. It described the period between the exhaustion of the previous year's stored grain and the appearance of the first spring vegetables. In a normal year, this gap was a matter of careful management, stretching the remaining stores, supplementing with whatever the hedgerows and rivers could offer, and enduring a period of reduced caloric intake without allowing it to become genuine starvation. In a year touched by plague, when the adults who had gathered the harvest might have died before the full stores were brought in, the hunger gap could narrow into something worse. The staple food of the medieval winter was pottage. This was not a dish with a fixed recipe, but a method, a slow-simmered stew built from whatever the household had available, cooked in a clay or iron pot suspended over the central hearth. For the poorest households, a thin pottage might consist of nothing more than dried peas or lentils, boiled in water, seasoned with a little salt, and whatever dried herbs had been tied up during the summer. For households with more resources, the pot would hold leeks, onions, garlic, cabbage, and occasionally a small piece of salted pork, added more for flavor than substance. The pot sat over the fire for most of the day and through much of the night. It was rarely fully emptied. New ingredients were added as old. One softened and broke down, and the cooking liquid accumulated the flavor and nutritional content of days of slow simmering. The historian Barbara Hannawalt, examining coroner's records from medieval England, noted that the central domestic fire was seldom cold. The pottage pot and the fire that heated it were the two constants of the peasant interior, maintained with the same daily care as any other survival mechanism. Bread was the other constant. Grain, primarily rye and barley in northern Europe. Wheat in more temperate southern regions was ground by hand on stone querns or taken to the lord's mill, mixed with water and a little leavening, and baked on a flat stone beside the fire or in the ashes. The bread produced by this process was dense and dark, with a coarse texture that modern palates would find unfamiliar. It was also highly caloric relative to its volume, providing the bulk of the energy a laboring household needed to maintain body heat through a cold day. Protein and fat came primarily from preserved meat. In autumn, a pig was the most common household animal slaughtered for winter stores. The pig was valued precisely because almost every part of it could be preserved. The fat was rendered into lard, used both for cooking and as a preservative for other cuts of meat. Larger pieces were rubbed heavily with salt and hung to air dry in the coolest part of the house, away from the direct heat of the fire. Some cuts were packed into ceramic jars and covered with a thick layer of the rendered lard, sealing the meat from air and moisture, in a process similar to what French cuisine would later call confit. Smaller scraps and organs were consumed in the days immediately following slaughter, when preservation was not yet necessary. The root cellar, or simply a cool pit dug into the earth floor of the house, extended the life of root vegetables through the winter. Turnips, carrots, and parsnips stored in cool, dark, slightly damp conditions could remain edible for months. The clay lining of the pit helped maintain a stable, low temperature that slowed biological degradation without freezing the vegetables solid. Onions and garlic were hung in braided ropes from the rafters, where the air circulation prevented mold. One of the most significant preserved foods was fermented cabbage, the sauerkraut recorded across Germanic, Slavic, and northern French regions. Cabbage heads were shredded, layered with salt in a large earthenware vessel, and pressed under a heavy stone to force out the liquid. The resulting brine, combined with the natural bacteria on the cabbage leaves, produced a lactic acid fermentation over a period of weeks. The fermented product, kept for months without spoiling and critically retained a significant portion of the vitamin C present in the original cabbage. In a winter diet almost entirely devoid of fresh fruit and green vegetables, this was not a trivial nutritional detail. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C, deficiency was a genuine risk in the later months of a long winter, and the household that maintained a pot of fermented cabbage had a partial defense against it. The smell of the medieval winter household was, in large part, the smell of these preserved foods. Wood smoke was the dominant note, but beneath it lay the sour, saline tang of fermentation, the dense mineral smell of dried beans and grain, the faint sweetness of slowly decomposing straw, and the sharper notes of drying meat and rendered fat. These were not unpleasant smells to those who lived with them. They were the smells of a household that had prepared, that had enough, that was going to make it through. In the plague winters, the management of food stores carried an additional weight. A household that lost adults to disease in October or November faced the prospect of reduced stores and reduced ability to gather or prepare the remaining food. Children who had lost parents, elderly people whose adult children had died. These were the households most at risk during the hunger gap, and the historical record shows that mortality in plague years was not evenly distributed across the seasons. The initial wave of deaths in autumn was followed, in many regions, by a secondary rise in mortality during late winter and early spring, attributable not to plague itself, but to the compounded effects of malnutrition, cold exposure, and the weakened immunity that followed a period of inadequate food. Winter survival was, in the end, a logistical achievement. The households that endured were the ones that had made the right decisions in the months before, storing enough, preserving carefully, managing their resources with the kind of quiet discipline that does not announce itself, but that shows up in the historical record as survival. The physicians of the 14th century did not know what caused the plague. This is not a simple statement about ignorance. It reflects the genuine limits of the intellectual framework available to them. Medical understanding in medieval Europe was built on the theoretical inheritance of ancient Greek and Roman writers, primarily Galen and Hippocrates, filtered through centuries of commentary and adjusted to accommodate Christian theology. Within this framework, disease was understood as an imbalance of the body's internal conditions, caused or exacerbated by external environmental factors. The most important of those external factors was air. The miasmatic theory held that corrupt or poisonous vapors rising from rotting matter, from swamps, unburied bodies, stagnant water, or simply the damp, still atmosphere of a winter fog, could enter the body through the breath and disturb its internal balance. The four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, needed to be held in a precise equilibrium for health to be maintained. Air thick with putrefaction could tip that balance, weakening the body's resistance and allowing disease to take hold. The word malaria, which would later name a specific infectious disease, derives directly from the Italian mala aria, bad air. In the context of the Black Death, this theory was not entirely wrong in its practical implications, even if its biological mechanism was misunderstood. The pneumonic form of plague was indeed transmitted through the air, through the shared breath of the sick and the healthy. The miasmatic understanding pointed physicians and households in the direction of ventilation, air purification, and distance from the sick, recommendations that, which had, for different reasons than those their authors intended, had some practical basis. The physician, Guy de Chauliac, who survived the first wave of the Black Death in Avignon and wrote one of the most detailed contemporary accounts of the disease, recommended staying close to a hot fire to keep the surrounding air warm and moving. He advised patients to avoid cold, damp environments and to keep their rooms dry. Marc Antonio Chiappi recommended filling rooms with heaps of dried roses and myrtle, aromatic plants whose scent was believed to overpower the corrupting vapors of plague air. Other physicians prescribed burning incense, aromatic woods, or juniper branches in the sick room. For the ordinary household, the practical application of these recommendations was adapted to available materials. Incense was a church commodity, largely unavailable to the peasant family. What they had were the same herbs used in cooking, rosemary, sage, thyme, and lavender, which could be dried and burned on the hearthstone to produce a fragrant smoke. Bundles of dried herbs hung near the fire served both a culinary and a prophylactic purpose. The scent of burning rosemary was, in the medieval understanding, a form of medicine as much as a source of flavor. Vinegar was another recommended prophylactic. It was carried in small sponges held to the nose when passing through areas where plague deaths had occurred, and its sharp acidic smell was believed to cut through the corrupt vapors of the miasma. Some households soaked cloths in vinegar and hung them over doorways. While vinegar cannot prevent plague infection, its acidity does have genuine antibacterial properties in direct contact, and the practice of washing hands and surfaces with diluted vinegar, recommended by some plague physicians, may have offered limited but real protection against some forms of bacterial transmission. The fumigation of rooms was a widely practiced response to plague in an affected household. When a family member died of the disease, the room was cleared of its remaining inhabitants, and a fire of green wood, damp straw, or aromatic branches was lit inside it, filling the space with thick smoke for several hours. This was intended to purify the air, to drive out the miasmatic vapors that were believed to linger after the death of a plague victim. In practice, the smoke may have had some effect on the parasites, fleas and lice, that had been living in the bedding and clothing of the deceased, killing or dispersing them before the room was reoccupied. For those who believed they were already infected, the treatments available were limited and often harmful. Bleeding, the removal of blood to restore humoral balance, was prescribed for those showing early plague symptoms. Lancing the buboes, the swollen lymph nodes characteristic of the bubonic form, was attempted by surgeons and barbers. Guy de Chauliac performed this procedure himself and credited it with his survival. In cases where the bubo burst spontaneously and drained, the patient occasionally did recover, which lent medical credibility to the intervention, even when it was performed under conditions that introduced additional infection. The spiritual dimension of plague medicine was inseparable from the physical. St. Roch was depicted in plague imagery, showing a bubo on his thigh. Miraculously, survived, accompanied by the dog that had fed him during his illness and recovery. St. Sebastian's martyrdom, his body pierced by arrows, was read as an image of the plague darts that God cast upon the earth in punishment for human sin. Devotional images of these saints were hung in homes and worn on the body. Small printed sheets, plague broadsides, circulated containing prayers, instructions for spiritual protection, and woodcut images of the saints. These were not seen as alternatives to physical medicine, but as its necessary complement. The body and the soul required simultaneous treatment. The amulet worn around the neck containing a written prayer or a fragment of sacred text was a particularly common object in households with young children. Parents who had watched older children or neighbors' children die could not always identify what had protected the survivors, and in the absence of that knowledge, every available layer of defense was employed. The spiritual and the physical, the herbal smoke and the whispered prayer, the vinegar-soaked cloth and the image of the saint. These were not contradictory strategies, but components of the same response, each addressing a different aspect of a danger whose full nature remained invisible. What the medieval household could observe was that some people died and some did not, that some precautions seemed to help and others did not, and that the disease moved in ways that defied simple prediction. They responded with the full range of tools their world provided: material, botanical, spiritual, and social. And the ones who survived did so through a combination of factors, most of which they could not have named. In winter, clothing was not a matter of fashion or social display for the peasant household. It was a second skin, a portable extension of the home's thermal strategy, and the quality of that clothing determined how much of the day could be spent in outdoor work and how well the body was protected during the long, cold hours of the night. The management of clothing, its production, maintenance, and layering, was a significant component of winter survival, occupying a substantial portion of the household's labor and resources. The primary material was wool. Sheep were kept across Europe not primarily for their meat, but for their fleece, which was sheared in late spring, cleaned, carded, spun, and woven into cloth over the subsequent months. The peasant household typically produced its own cloth from its own sheep, using a hand spindle and a ground loom, or a simple upright loom that could be set up inside the house during winter. This was predominantly women's work, performed during the watch hours of the winter night, during the short afternoon light of January, and in any other interstitial period when outdoor labor was not demanded. Wool's thermal properties made it uniquely suited to the demands of the medieval winter. Its fibers trap air, creating an insulating layer around the body that resists the movement of heat from the skin to the surrounding air. Unlike linen or early forms of cotton, wool retains much of this insulating capacity when wet, a critical property in an environment where rain, snow, and perspiration were constant factors. A wet linen shirt pressed against the skin in below freezing temperatures draws heat from the body rapidly. A wet wool tunic, under the same conditions, continues to provide meaningful insulation. The layering of wool garments was the standard approach to cold management. Against the skin was a close-fitted linen undergarment, a shift or chemise, which absorbed perspiration and could be washed more easily than the outer layers. Over this went one or more wool tunics, typically loose enough to trap air between the layers, which added to the insulating effect. In the coldest conditions, an outer garment of heavier wool, a cloak, or in some regions a hooded cowl, completed the system. The hood was particularly important. Heat loss through the unprotected head is disproportionately high, and a well-fitted hood that could be drawn down over the face in driving snow or freezing wind offered protection that the rest of the layered system could not compensate for. For the feet, leather shoes or boots were the norm where leather was available. In poorer households, wooden-soled clogs or wraparound footcloths beneath a leather sole provided some insulation from the frozen ground. The foot was also protected from the inside by wool hose, knitted or cut and sewn from woven fabric that covered the leg from ankle to knee or higher. Standing or walking on frozen earth or snow for hours at a time, as the work of winter required, gathering wood, tending animals, carrying water, demanded that the foot be protected from conductive heat loss as much as from direct cold. The maintenance of winter clothing was a continuous task. Wool garments, worn daily, through weeks of outdoor labor, accumulated dirt, grease, and the various organic material of a working environment. Washing was performed infrequently in winter. cold water was dangerous in freezing temperatures, and the fuel required to heat water for washing was a direct competition with the fuel needed for warmth and cooking. Garments were more often beaten clean, brushed and aired near the fire than washed in water. This limited laundering is one of the reasons the body louse found medieval winter clothing such a hospitable environment. The louse lived in the seams and folds of clothing, feeding on the human host and laying its eggs in the fabric, protected from cold by the warmth of the body beneath. In plague years, the clothing of the dead was a point of specific concern and specific danger. Garments worn by plague victims were valuable items. Wool cloth represented months of labor, and poverty made discarding usable material nearly impossible. Yet clothing that had been in close contact with a plague victim, particularly bedding and undergarments, was almost certainly contaminated with the parasites that had been living on the body. The reuse of a dead person's clothing by survivors brought those survivors into direct contact with potentially infected lice and fleas. Contemporary accounts record that plague clothing was sometimes burned, particularly in wealthier households or in towns where civic authorities attempted to impose disposal rules. In rural households, the calculation was different. A child whose parent had died might have no other warm clothing available for the winter. A surviving sibling might inherit a garment that carried a vector of the disease that had killed its previous owner. The historians who have studied the spread of plague within families have noted that secondary deaths, those occurring days or weeks after an initial plague death in the household, follow a pattern consistent with continued exposure through shared personal items. The fur that trimmed the garments of the wealthy, the miniver and sable of illuminated manuscripts, was not available to the peasant household, but cheaper pelts were. Rabbit fur, sheepskin with the fleece intact, and the tanned skins of various small animals were worked into linings for hoods or outer garments when they could be obtained. These added meaningful warmth, and the trapping and snaring of rabbits was one of the winter occupations that supplemented both the fur and the food supply of households, with access to appropriate land. At night, the clothing served a final function. Outer garments, the heavy cloak, the thick wool tunic, were folded and laid over the sleeping family as additional blankets. The line between bedding and clothing was not clearly drawn. The same items served both purposes, and the body's warmth accumulated under these layers through the night in the same way it was maintained by the layered system during the day. 2. Dress in the morning was, in part, simply to rearrange what had been sleeping under. The clothing of the medieval winter was thus not merely protective covering, but a system, produced in the household, maintained through ongoing labor, worn in overlapping layers, and managed with the same deliberate attention that governed every other aspect of winter survival. It was, like the wattle walls and the banked fire, one of the overlapping defenses that, taken together, made the long season possible to endure. Beyond the door of the peasant house, the winter village existed in a state of enforced contraction. The roads that connected settlements to one another, unpaved tracks across clay and chalk and heavy soil, became, in rain and frost, nearly impassable. The rivers that provided drinking water, fish, and waterborne transport froze from the edges inward, narrowing the navigable channel and eventually stopping it altogether. The fields that defined the village's economic purpose lay frozen and unworkable. The social world that operated through markets, fairs, and seasonal labor dissolved for months into the quiet of individual households. This isolation was not total. Villages maintained their internal social fabric through the winter, and the parish church continued to function as the organizational center of community life regardless of the season. The church bells marked the hours of the day for people who had no other timekeeping mechanism. They called the village to services, Sunday Mass, the feast days of the saints, the offices of the liturgical calendar. And in plague years, they rang for the dead with a frequency that would have been audible across the village and into the surrounding fields. The parish priest occupied a particular position during the plague winters. His role was simultaneously spiritual and administrative. He kept the records of baptisms, marriages, and burials that constitute much of what we now know about mortality in this period. He administered the last rites to the dying. a sacrament considered essential for the soul's passage, and this duty brought him into close contact with plague victims at the most infectious stage of their illness. Parish clergy died in large numbers during the Black Death. In some dioceses of England and southern France, more than half the recorded clergy died between 1348 and 1350. Replacement priests, often inadequately trained, were ordained in haste to fill the gaps. The social logic of the medieval village was built around the assumption of collective labor. The open field system, in which the village's agricultural land was divided into strips worked by individual households, but managed communally, required coordination among neighbors for plowing, planting, harvesting, and the rotation of crops. In winter, this collective logic expressed itself through shared maintenance, repair of communal structures, clearing of shared pathways, care for the animals that grazed on the village's common land. When the plague reduced the population of a village significantly, this collective labor system could collapse with sudden completeness. A village that lost a third of its adult working population in a single autumn might find itself unable to perform the tasks that the remainder of the winter required. Wood gathering, which was already arduous, became more so. The maintenance of animals became harder when the people who had tended them were gone. In some cases, the surviving inhabitants of a severely affected village abandoned it entirely, relocating to a neighboring settlement where the population remained sufficient to maintain the basic functions of communal life. Archaeological evidence from several regions of England, France, and Germany documents what became known as deserted medieval villages, settlements that were occupied continuously for generations and then, in the mid-14th century, simply ceased to be inhabited. Not all of these abandonments were direct consequences of plague mortality. Some reflected the longer process of agricultural reorganization that the plague accelerated. But the correlation between the years of the Black Death and the earliest dating of many deserted village sites is consistent enough to suggest that, in a significant number of cases, the plague was the proximate cause. For the villages that continued to function, the winter months of the plague years had a particular quality described in several contemporary accounts as an unnatural quiet. The normal sounds of a winter village, the voices of neighbors passing in the lane, the livestock shifting in their enclosures, the distant rhythms of communal work were diminished or absent. Households that had lost members sealed their doors and managed alone. The social visits that would ordinarily have connected households through the winter, the shared labor, the evening gatherings, the collective observances, became freighted with risk because proximity was now understood, however imperfectly, to be dangerous. The authorities of the period attempted various administrative responses to the plague. Some towns issued ordinances restricting the movement of people from infected areas. Some imposed quarantine measures on households where plague deaths had occurred, marking the doors with crosses or other signs to warn passers-by. The word quarantine itself derives from the Italian quarantina, meaning a period of 40 days, the duration of isolation imposed on ships arriving in Venetian harbors from infected ports. First formalized in 1377 in the city of Ragusa on the Adriatic coast. In rural villages, such formal measures were rarely applied with consistency. The administrative infrastructure required to enforce a quarantine, the personnel, the resources, the legal authority, was largely absent at the village level. What operated instead was a more informal social avoidance based on the observable fact that those who had been in close contact with the sick tended to become sick themselves. Neighbors avoided the houses of the recently bereaved. The rituals of collective mourning, the gathering of the community at the deathbed, the communal meal following burial, contracted or were suspended during the worst periods of mortality. The churchyard, which in ordinary winters was visited occasionally for the burials that every community experienced across the year, became in the plague winters a space of continuous activity. Contemporary accounts describe grave diggers working by torchlight, unable to complete the work in daylight hours. In towns, mass graves were dug to manage the volume of bodies. In rural parishes, individual burial rites were compressed or simplified when the priest himself was ill, or when the surviving family members were too few or too weakened to perform the customary ceremonies. The village in winter during the plague years was a place in which the ordinary routines of the cold season, the stacking of wood, the feeding of animals, the preparation of food, the management of fire, continued because they had to, because stopping them meant death, even as the community that had always performed these tasks together was diminished in ways that made the tasks harder and the silence between households louder. Warmth in the medieval winter was not delivered. It was made. Every unit of heat that kept a family alive through the cold months had to be gathered, carried, and managed by human effort, and the scale of that effort, measured in hours and physical exertion, was substantially larger than the modern world has any everyday equivalent for. Wood was the primary fuel, and its procurement was the central winter labor. A typical peasant household in northern Europe required a significant quantity of wood to maintain a fire through the months between November and March, not a constant blazing fire, but the steady, managed combustion that kept the hearth smoldering through the night and burning more actively through the day. The gathering of that wood under the constraints of the manorial system, limited to fallen branches and dead material from the common woodland, required hours of daily labor from multiple household members. The work was physically demanding in ways that accumulated over weeks. Dead wood and fallen branches had to be located across a landscape that might be covered in snow or frozen solid, making movement difficult and the identification of usable material harder. The wood, once gathered, had to be carried back to the house, bundled and dragged or loaded onto a cart if a household was fortunate enough to have one. Wet wood, pulled from under snow cover, needed to be dried near the fire before it would burn effectively, which meant that the supply in use was always several days behind the supply being gathered. Planning the wood store was a continuous calculation. In the post-plague decades, this labor underwent a significant economic shift. Before the Black Death, labor was cheap and land was scarce. Landlords set the terms of labor obligations, and peasants worked a substantial portion of their time in service to the lord's needs before attending to their own. After the first waves of mortality, the labor market inverted. With fewer workers available to perform the same work, surviving peasants found themselves in a position to negotiate, and the records of the period show wages for agricultural workers in England rising by more than 100% between 1349 and 1399. This rise in wages had direct implications for the practical management of the winter household. A peasant family with better income could afford to pay for services that had previously been unavailable: the carting of wood, the milling of grain, the hire of additional labor during the harvest season. Better wages also meant better clothing and, over time, improved housing. The decades following the first plague wave saw a gradual improvement in the quality of peasant domestic architecture across England and northwestern France. Thicker walls, better roofing, the beginnings of the stone and timber construction that would eventually replace the simplest cruck houses. The transition from arable to pastoral farming that accompanied the depopulation had its own effect on winter fuel. The abandonment of marginal grain-growing land left large areas of previously cultivated ground reverting to scrub and secondary woodland. This second-growth woodland, lower trees and denser brush than old-growth forest, was in many ways better suited to the peasant fuel gatherer than mature timber. Smaller diameter branches from young trees required less processing and were easier to carry. The expansion of common pasture and the reduction in the competition for access to woodland resources meant that surviving households in many regions found themselves with access to more fuel per person than had been available before the plague. Peat was an important supplementary fuel in regions where it was available: the wet lowlands of Ireland, northern England, the Low Countries, and parts of northern Germany. Peat bogs were worked in late summer when the material could be cut into blocks, stacked in open-sided structures to dry over the autumn, and stored for winter use. A well-dried peat block burned slowly and steadily, producing sustained heat with less intensive tending than wood required. It also produced a distinctive smoke, heavier and more aromatic than wood smoke, that permeated everything in the home where it was used. The labor of warmth extended to the management of animals. Most peasant households kept livestock through the winter: oxen for plowing, a cow or two for milk, sheep for wool and occasional meat. Pigs fattened on autumn mast and slaughtered before the deep cold. These animals required daily feeding and watering throughout the winter months. In the coldest regions, they were sometimes brought into the lower section of the house, the byre, where their body heat contributed to the overall warmth of the combined structure. The sounds and smells of housed animals were part of the winter domestic environment. The shifting of cattle in the straw, the warmth rising from their bodies, the characteristic smell of manure and hay that mixed with the wood smoke and the cooking smells of the human space above. The water supply required constant maintenance. Streams and wells could freeze, and breaking the ice each morning to reach drinkable water was a daily task that could not be deferred. Larger settlements might have water carriers who brought water from maintained sources. Smaller households managed their own access. Snow could be melted for water, a technique used in extreme conditions, but the volume of snow required to produce a meaningful amount of water was large and melting. It consumed fuel that was already in limited supply. Viewed as a whole, the winter of the medieval peasant was a continuous performance of labor, in which the goal was simply the maintenance of the conditions necessary for life: warmth, water, food, and shelter in good repair. The Black Death intersected with this labor in multiple ways, reducing the number of people available to perform it, disrupting the social systems through which it had traditionally been organized, and in some cases making the labor itself a vector of exposure, as people who gathered in shared spaces to perform communal tasks carried the infection between them. And yet, the labor continued. The fires were kept, the wood was gathered, the animals were fed, the pottage simmered over the hearth. The households that survived did so because someone within them continued to perform these tasks day after day through the long, cold months, holding the household together through the simple, repeated act of keeping it warm. The youngest members of a medieval household occupied a particular position in the winter economy of warmth. They were the most vulnerable to cold, the least able to generate their own body heat through movement and labor, and the most dependent on the thermal management of the adults around them. At the same time, in a household where every person's contribution to the daily work of survival was counted, children were also participants in the gathering of brushwood, the tending of small animals, the carrying of water, and the lighter forms of indoor work that filled the winter hours. Infants in the coldest months of the year were managed through a combination of swaddling and proximity. The practice of wrapping newborns tightly in bands of linen, swaddling, served purposes that were understood simultaneously as physical and developmental. The tight binding was believed to encourage the limbs to grow straight, a concern rooted in the medical thinking of the period. But it also had an immediate thermal benefit. A swaddled infant could be placed near the fire, hung in a cradle from a ceiling beam above the hearth, or tucked into the communal bed alongside adults, and the wrapping held the body's own heat close while limiting the surface area through which that heat could escape. The cradle, suspended from the rafters or rocked on a curved base beside the fire, kept the infant above the cold floor and within the warmer air that accumulated near the ceiling. In the deepest winter nights, when the fire was banked and the room temperature dropped, the infant shared the communal bed, nestled against a parent's body. The mortality rate for infants in this period was high under ordinary circumstances. A significant proportion of children born in the 14th century did not survive their first year, and the winter months represented an intensification of that baseline risk. Older children, from perhaps the age of 4 or 5, were expected to begin contributing to household labor. The gathering of brushwood was particularly suited to smaller bodies that could move easily through undergrowth and collect the fallen branches that adults might overlook or find awkward to retrieve. Children carried water, fed chickens, collected eggs, and assisted with the indoor work of spinning and simple food preparation. In the hours of the winter watch, older children might sit beside an adult at the fire, learning the spinning or weaving techniques that would be among the most important productive skills of their adult lives. The education of children in this period was almost entirely practical. Formal schooling existed in towns attached to cathedral schools or religious institutions, but the children of peasant households learned through participation in the work of the household. A child who reached the age of 12 or 13 in a functioning peasant family knew how to manage a fire, preserve food, tend animals, and perform the seasonal tasks that kept the household alive. This knowledge was not transmitted through instruction so much as through observation and gradual incorporation into the work itself. In the plague years, the position of children shifted in ways that were both practical and profound. Children who lost parents faced an immediate crisis of provision. The household stored food, its fire management, its social connections to the wider village. All of these depended on adult knowledge and adult labor. A child left without parents in midwinter, in a house with a diminishing wood store and no adult to manage the banked fire through the night, faced dangers that were as immediate as the disease itself. The response to orphaned children in this period was governed primarily by the extended family and the parish community, rather than by any formal institutional mechanism. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and older siblings absorbed younger children when the immediate household was disrupted. Neighbors took in children from households where all adults had died. The parish, through the priest and the church wardens, tracked the situation of the most vulnerable and directed charitable resources. Small food distributions, the use of the church building for shelter in extreme cases, toward those most at need. There is evidence in wills and in coroners' records from the plague decades of adults making explicit provisions for the care of their children in anticipation of their own deaths from plague. These records show a population that was thinking ahead, that recognized the speed with which the disease could remove the adults of a household, and that was attempting to create some continuity of care for the youngest members even in the midst of catastrophic mortality. The children who survived the plague winters of the mid-14th century grew up in a changed world. They had watched the disease work through their communities at an age when such experiences leave lasting impressions, and the practical knowledge they had absorbed about winter management, the fire, the stored food, the shared warmth, was shaped by the context of that loss. The generation that came of age in the 1360s and 1370s inherited a Europe with fewer people, more available land, and, gradually, somewhat better conditions for the survivors. They also inherited a particular relationship to the winter season, formed in the years when it had meant something more than cold and darkness. The demographic recovery from the Black Death was slow. Population levels in parts of Europe did not return to pre-plague levels for more than a century. In some regions, not until well into the 16th century. The children of the plague winters were the foundation of that recovery, small in number relative to what had existed before, but carrying forward the practical knowledge, the social connections, and the adaptive capacity that the household had always been the primary vehicle for transmitting. The sensory world of the medieval winter night was unlike anything the modern world offers as a comparison. The nearest equivalent, a remote rural location on a dark winter night, far from road noise and artificial light, approximates only one dimension of it. The medieval night had its own particular acoustic character, shaped by the materials of the built environment, the absence of background noise from machinery and traffic, and the specific sounds that the season and the plague years added to the ordinary texture of darkness. Inside the house, the dominant sound was the fire. A maintained hearth fire is not a quiet thing. The combustion of wood produces a continuous series of small sounds. The creak of heating timber, the soft collapse of ash, the periodic crack of resin pockets in the wood releasing their heat. A fire with green or damp wood added to it hisses and spits. A fire burning down toward coals produces a lower, steadier sound, almost a breath. These sounds were the acoustic anchor of the interior night, the background against which all other sounds were registered. The breathing of the household, the slow, even rhythms of deep sleep, was audible in a room of the dimensions typical of the peasant cruck house. In the first sleep, several people breathing slowly in the dark created a sound that was both intimate and reassuring, evidence of life present and continuing. During the watch, these rhythms changed. The waking person sitting by the fire could hear the particular quiet of the house around them and could distinguish, as a parent always can, the breathing that indicated health from the breathing that indicated something else. The animals, if housed in the byre attached to the dwelling, contributed their own sounds. The periodic shifting of an ox in straw, the soft vocalization of a cow, the settling sound of sheep packed together in a pen. These animal sounds were, for the people who heard them every night, part of the ordinary reassurance of the household in order. An unusual silence from the byre, or an unusual disturbance was a signal worth attending to, just as an unusual silence from a neighbor's house was worth noting. Outside the walls, the winter night had its own acoustic range. Wind was the most variable element, moving through the thatch with a sound that varied from a low sigh to something more forceful when the weather was severe, pressing against the shuttered windows, finding gaps in the wattle and daub and whistling through them. Snow, when it fell, produced a particular quality of silence that was audible as an absence rather than a sound, the muffling of the small ambient noises that otherwise filled the night air, creating a stillness that was both beautiful and isolating. The church bells were the primary clock of the medieval village. They rang the canonical hours. The divisions of the liturgical day likened the sound of a distant bell at the canonical hour of matins, corresponding to the watch, was familiar to anyone awake in the middle of the night. In plague years, the bells also rang for the dead, and the frequency of that tolling was a real-time indicator of how the disease was progressing through the community. Contemporary accounts from several towns describe the bells ringing so continuously during the worst periods that authorities attempted to restrict their use, not to disguise the mortality, but because the constant sound was affecting the living in ways that seemed to compound the fear and despair already present. The sounds of mourning were part of the winter acoustic environment during the plague decades. Medieval death rituals involved vocalized lamentation, keening and crying that were not merely emotional expressions, but performed social acts, ways of announcing a death to the community and marking the transition of the deceased. These sounds carried through the winter air to neighboring houses in ways that a modern building with insulated walls and double-glazed windows would not permit. The household that heard lamentation from the house down the lane knew with certainty that another neighbor was gone. During the watch, the person sitting by the fire was the household's ear as well as its fire tender. They listened for the sounds of the night, the occasional footstep on the frozen path outside, the distant sound of a cart, the barking of dogs responding to something moving through the village. Dogs in the medieval village were reliable acoustic sensors. Their response to the night distinguished between what was ordinary and what warranted attention. A dog that barked and then fell quiet was responding to a passing animal. A dog that barked persistently or that was conspicuously absent told a different story. The acoustic world of the plague winter also included sounds that had no precedent in the ordinary run of winters. The sound of a body being carried, the particular rhythm of a stretcher or a board, the muffled voices of those carrying it, became in the worst weeks a sound that was heard with some regularity. In towns where mortality was concentrated and civic organization more developed, the specific sound associated with plague disposal, the cart, the voices of the collectors, became one of the defining sounds of the period in contemporary accounts. In the village, these sounds were more dispersed, less organized, but no less present. They were the sounds of a community managing an event beyond the scale of its ordinary experience, doing so with the resources and the rhythms it had always used, and registering the difference between this winter and all the winters before it through the particular quality of what could be heard in the dark. The person sitting by the banked fire during the watch in a house in a village in the winter of 1349 heard a world that was both completely familiar and fundamentally altered. The fire still made its sounds. The sleepers still breathed. The wind still moved through the thatch. And somewhere in the village, more often than before, the bells were ringing. Time in the medieval winter was measured differently than time in the modern world, and the difference went deeper than the absence of clocks. The modern experience of time is largely constant across seasons. The hours of the day are the same length in January as in July. The week proceeds by the same names and the same structure, regardless of how much daylight accompanies it. And the year is divided by the calendar rather than by the body's experience of light and dark. The medieval peasant lived in a different relationship with time, one in which the season determined not only how time was filled, but how it was perceived. The canonical hours, the liturgical divisions of the day maintained by the church and signaled by bell, divided the day into segments that varied in length with the season. The system was built on the ancient Roman division of daylight into 12 equal hours, which meant that a winter hour was shorter than a summer hour. In the depth of January, the hours between sunrise and sunset were compressed, and the canonical hours that fell within them were correspondingly shorter. The hours of darkness, Compline, Matins, Lauds, were longer. This variable hour was not felt as a distortion. It was simply the natural rhythm of the seasonal day. For the peasant household, the church bells provided the primary external time signal, but the body itself was a reliable secondary clock. The rhythms of hunger, fatigue, and the light-dark cycle were strong enough cues that people living without artificial light maintained a consistent relationship with the solar day, waking with first light or in winter with the gray beginning of dawn was not an effort, but a default. The household that had slept its first sleep, and its watch and its second sleep, woke naturally. At or near sunrise, which in January in northern France arrived well after what a modern person would consider a reasonable hour. The liturgical calendar provided the larger structure of the winter season. Advent, the 4 weeks before Christmas, was a period of preparation and fasting, which in practical terms meant a reduction in the meat and rich foods that might otherwise be consumed in the early part of the winter. Christmas itself was a feast day, one of the major celebrations of the year, when the household's better stores were opened. A piece of salted pork, perhaps, or a preserved bird, and the community gathered at the parish church. The 12 days of Christmas extended the festive period through to Epiphany on the 6th of January, after which the winter resumed its ordinary character. Candlemas on the 2nd of February marked a significant psychological threshold in the winter calendar. It fell at approximately the midpoint between the winter solstice and the spring equinox, and it was associated across Europe with a cautious assessment of whether winter was nearing its end. The folk tradition of observing animal behavior on Candlemas, looking for signs that certain creatures were emerging from their winter dormancy, reflects the intense attention that agricultural communities paid to any indication that the worst of the cold was passing. In plague years, the approach of Candlemas carried additional significance because spring meant the potential return of the flea-borne forms of the disease that had been suppressed by winter temperatures. The winter was also marked by saints' days that punctuated the weeks with their own character. St. Thomas's Day in December, St. Agnes's Day in January, St. Blaise's Day in February. These feast days were occasions for specific observances, specific foods where tradition called for them, and the particular prayers associated with each saint. In plague years, the saints associated with protection from disease, Sebastian and Roch, received heightened devotional attention at every opportunity in the liturgical calendar that brought them forward. For children, the marking of time had a different quality than for adults. The major feast days stood out as the primary landmarks of the year, points of reference in a temporal landscape that otherwise flowed without strong markers. The child who was 5 years old at Christmas could measure their growth toward the spring planting season, toward the summer harvest, toward the next Christmas, in a cycle that was both comforting in its regularity and punctuated by the sharp events. A death in the household, an unusually severe frost, the news of plague in a neighboring village that made certain winters different from all the others. In the plague decades, the ordinary passage of time acquired a quality that several contemporary writers attempted to capture. The Florentine chronicler Giovanni Villani, who died of plague in 1348, while writing his history of Florence, left the sentence describing the plague unfinished in the middle of a word, a gap that later readers found more eloquent than any completed sentence could have been. The sense conveyed in the surviving plague literature is of time both moving too fast, the death following too quickly on the onset of symptoms, the household depleted before the household had prepared itself, and too slow, the winter stretching out, the disease returning when spring should have ended it, the weeks between infection and recovery or death measured in hours rather than the ordinary days. The passage of the winter itself, regardless of plague, was experienced as something to be endured and measured toward its conclusion. The shortening of the night after the solstice was noticed and noted. The first appearance of snowdrops in February was observed as a real signal, not merely a poetic one. The lengthening of the afternoon light in late February and early March, when it became possible to work outdoors for an extra hour before the light failed, was a tangible relief. These gradual changes were the true clock of the winter season, and the household that had managed its stores, its fire, and its health through the deepest months measured its progress towards spring, not by dates, but by these incremental returns of light and warmth. In the winters of the plague, this passage took on an additional layer of meaning. Surviving the winter was not simply the accomplishment it was in ordinary years. It was evidence of something, of the household's resilience, of the maintenance of its practices, of whatever combination of circumstance and care had kept the disease from completing what it had begun. The first genuinely warm day of March, when the ground softened and the air lost its edge and the birds returned to the hedgerows, arrived in plague years, as it arrived in all years. Without announcement, without ceremony, simply, as the next morning's particular quality of light, the Black Death killed, by the most widely accepted modern estimates, between 30 and 60% of the European population in its first wave between 1347 and 1351. Regional variation was significant. Some areas experienced higher mortality, some lower, but the overall scale of loss was without precedent in the recorded history of the continent. Understanding what this meant at the level of the individual household and the local community requires moving from the aggregate to the particular, from the percentage to the specific arithmetic of a village or a lane. A village of 200 people, losing 40% of its population in a single year, lost 80 people. In a community where kinship networks were dense, where a significant proportion of households were related to one another through marriage and descent over several generations. 80 deaths were not 80 separate losses. They were losses that cascaded through the community's social structure, removing nodes and networks that had organized labor, credit, mutual assistance, and the transmission of local knowledge. A craftsman who died took his skills with him. A midwife who died left a gap in the community's capacity to manage childbirth. An elder whose memory contained the practical history of the village's common land, its drainage channels, its traditional grazing rights, its seasonal patterns, died with that knowledge inaccessible. The winter following the first wave of plague mortality was a period in which surviving communities had to reassess their capacity to perform the functions they had always performed. This reassessment was not abstract. It was immediate and practical. Who would now plow the south field if the family that had always plowed it was gone? Who would tend the mill if the miller and his sons had all died in November? Who held the knowledge of which stretch of the river produced fish in February, and how to read the ice for safe crossing? In many cases, the answer was that the surviving community absorbed these functions by redistribution. Neighbors took on additional obligations. The Lord Steward assigned available labor to essential tasks, and the gap left by a skilled tradesperson was filled, imperfectly at first, by someone who had observed the work without performing it. This redistribution was a significant form of knowledge transfer, and it happened under conditions of stress and reduced information, which meant that some of what was transferred was incomplete or inaccurate. The economic records of the period, manor rolls, tax assessments, and the accounts of monastic estates show the visible traces of this redistribution. Holdings that had been worked by a single family appear in the records being divided between surviving relatives or taken on by unrelated tenants. Land that had been cultivated for generations is recorded as lying fallow, its previous occupant dead and no one yet assigned to work it. Rents that had been collected reliably for decades are noted as unpaid, the tenant dead, the land vacant. The emotional arithmetic of loss is harder to document than the economic, but it is present in the surviving literature. The Italian writer Petrarch, who lost his close friend Laura to the plague in 1348, wrote about grief in terms that resonated with readers across Europe, precisely because they described a specific quality of loss that the plague made universal. The loss of people who had been expected to survive, who had been part of the structure of daily life in ways that their absence made visible only after they were gone. The grief described in plague literature is not the grief of old age or long illness. It is the grief of sudden arbitrary removal without preparation or farewell. In the peasant household, grief was managed within the same practical framework that governed everything else. The rituals of mourning, the vigil beside the body, the processional to the church, the burial, the commemorative meal, provided structure for the transition from presence to absence. But in plague years, these rituals were frequently compressed or bypassed, when deaths were too numerous or too rapid for the full ceremony, when the priest was himself ill or dead, when the family had lost so many members that no one remained to observe the proper forms. The ordinary scaffolding of bereavement was absent. The psychological effect of this absence was noted by contemporary observers. Boccaccio, writing in the Decameron about the plague in Florence, described the way in which the normal social obligations around death, the gathering of neighbors, the display of mourning, the ceremonial functions of kinship, simply ceased during the worst periods. People died, he wrote, with less ceremony than a goat. This observation was not made with detachment. It reflected a genuine disruption in the social mechanisms through which grief was processed and community was maintained. In the rural winter, this disruption had specific consequences. The community that gathered at a burial in ordinary times was the same community that would provide assistance to the bereaved household in the weeks that followed, bringing food, helping with labor, checking that the children were cared for. When the gathering could not happen, or when so many members of the community were themselves bereaved that the capacity for mutual assistance was exhausted, the household was left to manage its loss with fewer external resources than would normally have been available. What the historical record also shows, though, is that communities did not simply dissolve under this pressure. The manor rolls and parish records that document the disruption of the plague years also document the gradual reconstitution of community function. New tenants taking on abandoned land, new families moving into depleted villages, new social arrangements emerging to replace those that had been destroyed. The winter of loss was followed in most places by a spring of reconstruction, slower and more effortful than what had existed before, but continuous with it in the practices and values that the surviving households carried forward. The arithmetic of loss was real and devastating. It reshaped the landscape, the economy, and the social structure of medieval Europe in ways that are still visible in the historical record 7 centuries later. But the households that endured those winters did so by holding on to the basic functions of domestic life: the fire, the food, the shared warmth, the care of the young, even when the community around them had contracted to a fraction of its former size. Spring arrived in the 14th century as it has always arrived, not on a fixed date, but as a gradual process, a slow loosening of the cold's hold on the landscape that could take weeks to complete and that progressed unevenly, with warm days interrupted by late frosts, with the ground softening and then hardening again before finally yielding to the season. For a household that had managed its way through the winter, the stores depleted but not exhausted, the fire still burning, the family diminished perhaps but present, the arrival of spring was the ending of a sustained effort that had required continuous attention for months. The first practical sign of spring for the agricultural household was the thawing of the ground. As long as the soil remained frozen, nothing could be planted, and the fields remained as locked as they had been since autumn. The moment the earth softened to the depth required for plowing, usually in late February in southern England and France, later further north, the work of the spring season began. Oxen were brought out of the byre where they had been housed through the winter, their condition carefully assessed after months of reduced exercise and winter fodder. The plow was checked and repaired. The fields that had lain under frost were turned in preparation for the spring sowing. The return of daylight had a physiological effect on the human body that was felt before it was consciously noted. The longer afternoons of February and March allowed for an extension of outdoor work that the household had been unable to perform during the short winter days. More light meant more productive hours, and more productive hours meant a reduction in the sense of compression, the feeling of too much to do in too little time, that characterized the winter months. The body responded to the light with something like energy, an increase in alertness and physical capacity that the medieval world had attributed to the warming of the blood and the restoration of the body's natural humoral balance. For the household that had experienced plague deaths during the winter, the spring was a different kind of threshold. The disease did not simply stop at the equinox. Its behavior was governed by the transmission dynamics that the cold had altered, and as temperatures rose and the rat flea became active again, the bubonic form of plague could return. Communities that had survived the pneumonic winter of respiratory transmission now faced the potential resumption of flea-borne transmission, which operated at the community level rather than within the enclosed household. The spring that ended the winter's cold also ended some of the winter's particular protections. The management of this transition was, again, conducted without the benefit of understanding what was actually happening at the biological level. What communities could observe was that the plague seemed to follow patterns, that certain seasons were more dangerous than others, that certain environments were associated with higher mortality, that the disease returned in waves rather than moving through a population once and disappearing. This observational knowledge accumulated across the decades of the second pandemic and shaped the gradually evolving public health responses that medieval and early modern European cities developed, including the quarantine measures, the lazarettos or plague hospitals, and the health boards that appear in the records of Italian cities from the late 14th century onward. The physical landscape of a post-plague spring had a particular quality noted in several contemporary accounts. Fields that had been continuously cultivated for generations lay unplanted. Buildings stood empty, their owners dead, their doors closed on interiors that held the possessions of the recently gone. In some villages, the silence that had settled over the winter remained into the spring, the remaining population too small and too dispersed to generate the ordinary sounds of a working agricultural community. In other places, the reorganization of population, the movement of survivors toward the most viable settlements, meant that some villages were more populated than before, having absorbed the remnants of nearby communities that had been too severely depleted to continue. The forests that surrounded the villages were recovering in their own way. With fewer people working the land and fewer people exercising their common rights to gather wood, the secondary woodland that had been kept in check by continuous harvesting was beginning to expand into the margins of cultivated land. This expansion would accelerate over the following decades as depopulation continued across multiple waves of plague recurrence, and it produced the landscape of encroachment. The hedgerows advancing into old field margins, the young trees colonizing abandoned ridge and furrow, that archaeologists and landscape historians can still trace in certain regions of England and France. For the household that had kept its fire through the winter, spring brought the easing of specific daily pressures. The fuel requirement dropped as temperatures rose and the hearth needed less continuous maintenance. The food stores, though depleted, were supplemented first by the early greens, nettles, chickweed, and watercress, all edible and all rich in the vitamins that the winter diet had lacked. The foraging of wild greens in early spring was a practiced skill, and the household that knew which plants to gather and when to find them had a meaningful nutritional supplement available before the first planted crops could be harvested. The animals that had been housed through the winter were turned out onto the common pasture as soon as the grass was growing sufficiently to support them. This was a moment of visible relief in the agricultural calendar. The management of housed animals was labor-intensive, and the fodder required to maintain them was a significant drain on the winter stores. Animals returned to pasture managed themselves. The labor they had required through the winter was released back to the other tasks of the spring season. The spring that followed the plague winters of the mid-14th century was not a return to what had existed before. The communities that moved through it were smaller, their social structures partially reconstructed, their economic relationships in the process of renegotiation. The landscape had changed. The labor market had changed. The relationship between lord and tenant was in the slow process of transformation that would, over the following generations, produce the social order of late medieval Europe. But the fire in the hearth was still there. The household that had maintained it through the winter carried it into the spring as evidence of what the winter had required and what the people in that house had been able to give. The warmth that had been so carefully managed through the dark months was no longer the central fact of daily life. It receded into the background as the season changed, becoming once again something available rather than something that had to be continuously made. And the family, whatever remained of it, moved forward into the longer days, carrying the winter's knowledge with them. The Black Death did not arrive once and depart. It came in waves, and the people who had survived the first outbreak of 1347 to 1351 lived with the knowledge, acquired through experience rather than theory, that the disease could return. It did return repeatedly for the next 3.5 centuries. The second pandemic, which historians mark as lasting from 1347 to 1815, was not a single event but a recurring presence, flaring in different regions at different times, subsiding for years, and then resurging with a severity that could equal or surpass the original outbreak in specific localities. The recurrence of plague shaped the psychology of the medieval and early modern household in ways that were distinct from the first wave. The initial outbreak of 1347 to 1351 struck a population with no prior experience of the disease and no accumulated social knowledge about how to respond to it. Subsequent waves struck communities that had been through the experience before, that had seen the pattern of symptoms, that had observed which measures seemed to offer some protection and which did not, and that had developed, however imperfectly, a set of responses to the onset of an outbreak. The recurrence also struck populations that had already been reduced by previous waves. Communities that had lost 30 or 40% of their members in the first outbreak and had spent the intervening years slowly rebuilding their population found themselves confronted again with mass mortality before the recovery was complete. In some regions of England and France, the second major wave of 1361 to 1362, known in England as the pestilence of children, because it appeared to kill younger people disproportionately, the generation that had been born after the first wave and therefore had no acquired immunity, completed the disruption that the first wave had begun. The winter behavior of recurring plague retained the characteristics of the first outbreak. The shift toward respiratory transmission in cold months, the persistence of vector-borne transmission through human parasites in bedding and clothing, the intensification of risk in enclosed domestic spaces. But the social context in which these transmission dynamics operated had changed. Households had learned across the decades of recurrence to modify some behaviors when plague was known to be in the region, to limit contact with outsiders, to avoid crowded gatherings, to isolate household members who showed early symptoms when possible. The concept of the infected house, a dwelling whose occupants had died of plague and which was therefore considered dangerous to enter, was a practical recognition of the transmission risk associated with the personal effects of the dead, even if its theoretical basis remained miasmatic rather than parasitological. In some towns, doors of infected houses were marked with crosses or other symbols, and civic regulations attempted to restrict the movement of people from those houses into the wider community. The logic was imperfect but directionally correct. The personal environment of plague victims was indeed a source of ongoing transmission risk through the parasites living in their clothing and bedding. The winter of a recurring plague year differed from an ordinary winter in the particular quality of its social contraction. The normal winter reduction in movement and social contact, already significant in a season when roads were poor and daylight was short, was compounded by the additional social avoidance that plague generated. Markets, which continued to operate through ordinary winters as essential venues for the exchange of food and goods, were sometimes closed or reduced when plague was active in the region. The gatherings that marked the winter liturgical calendar, the Christmas and Epiphany celebrations that brought the community together at the parish church, were disrupted in the worst years by the combination of fear and mortality. The priests who survived multiple waves of plague developed a working theology of recurrence, a framework for understanding why God's punishment, having once been delivered, was delivered again. The prevailing interpretation was that human sinfulness had not been sufficiently corrected by the first visitation, that the surviving population had returned to its habitual vices rather than pursuing the reform the first plague had demanded. This interpretation was not simply an official position. It was genuinely held by many of the people who wrote about recurring plague, and it shaped the intensification of devotional practice that characterized the late 14th and early 15th centuries. The flagellant movement, groups of men who traveled between towns publicly. scourging themselves as acts of penance, emerged in response to the first outbreak and recurred with subsequent waves. These processions moved through the winter landscape from town to town, performing their rituals of penance in public spaces and attracting crowds of onlookers. The Church eventually condemned the flagellant movement, but its existence reflects the depth of the anxiety that recurrent plague generated and the range of responses that anxiety produced. For the household, the recurring nature of the plague required a kind of long-term adaptive management that the first wave had not demanded. The preparations for winter that had always been necessary, the fuel, the stored food, the maintenance of the house's thermal capacity, just carried an additional layer of preparation for the possibility of illness within the household during the cold months. Some households maintained small stores of the herbs and materials recommended for plague medicine alongside their ordinary food stores. Some held devotional objects specifically associated with plague protection as permanent fixtures of the domestic interior. The winter of a recurring plague year was thus shaped by two overlapping forms of anticipation: the ordinary anticipation of cold, darkness, and the hunger gap that had always characterized the season, and the added anticipation of a disease that might or might not return in any given year, but whose return was always possible. Living with that combination, the practical requirements of winter survival and the psychological weight of recurring epidemic, was the particular condition of the European household for the 3.5 centuries of the second pandemic. The medical profession that existed in 14th century Europe was organized on a hierarchical model that had relatively little to do with the experience of the ordinary peasant household during a plague winter. At the top of this hierarchy sat the university-trained physician, educated in the theoretical framework of Galenic medicine, capable of reading and writing in Latin, and employed by those wealthy enough to afford professional consultation. Below the physician in the social and professional order were the surgeons, practitioners of manual interventions, including bleeding, wound treatment, and the lancing of abscesses. And below them, the apothecaries, who compounded and sold medicinal preparations. At the base of the formal medical system and largely outside it were the empirics, the herbalists, the wise women, and the midwives who provided the practical medical care available to rural communities. The university physician's response to the Black Death was documented in several learned treatises produced in the years immediately following the first outbreak. The medical faculty of the University of Paris, responding to a request from the French King Philip VI, produced a formal account of the plague's causes in 1348 that attributed the disease to a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius in 1345, which had produced a corruption of the air that continued to circulate through the atmosphere. This explanation, while entirely wrong in its mechanism, was internally consistent with the medical and astronomical theory of the period and represented the best thinking of the most formally educated practitioners available. Guy de Chauliac, the papal physician in Avignon who survived the first wave and wrote about it in detail, offered clinical observations that were more practically useful than the astrological explanation, though still framed within the humoral and miasmatic understanding of his time. His description of the two phases of the disease, a first phase producing buboes and a second phase producing pulmonary symptoms, was accurate in outline and helped establish the clinical distinction between bubonic and pneumonic forms that would be refined by later observers. His recommendation to lance mature buboes and his observation that patients sometimes recovered following this intervention was based on clinical experience rather than theory and had some genuine basis in outcome. For the peasant household, however, none of this professional apparatus was accessible. The university physician practiced in cities. The surgeon operated in towns. The apothecaries' compounded medicines were urban commodities. The rural household in a winter plague relied on the local knowledge that had always governed domestic medicine. The herbalist or wise woman who knew the properties of local plants, the midwife who had managed illness alongside childbirth across decades of practice, and the accumulated traditional knowledge about what helped and what did not that circulated through the community in oral form. This traditional medical knowledge was not simply superstition, it was the product of long observation, and while it could not address the underlying cause of plague, it addressed many of the symptoms and complications that accompanied it. Willow bark which contains salicylic acid, the active compound in modern aspirin, was used for fever. Elderflower preparations were used for respiratory symptoms. Garlic, which has genuine antimicrobial properties, was recommended both as a preventive and as a treatment. Honey, which has demonstrable antibacterial properties in direct application, was used for wound care. None of these remedies could cure plague, but in a disease where secondary infections and complications were significant contributors to mortality, the management of symptoms mattered. The line between medicine and food in the winter household was not sharply drawn. The pottage that simmered over the hearth all day was also a therapeutic preparation when illness was present, easily digestible, warm, sustaining to a body too weakened to manage solid food. The herbs added to the pot for flavor, thyme, rosemary, sage, were also the herbs recommended by folk medicine for respiratory ailments. The onion and garlic that gave the pottage its savory character were simultaneously the plants most consistently recommended in plague prevention literature across both learned and popular traditions. The management of a sick household member in winter required specific practical adjustments. The ill person needed warmth, which the communal bed could provide, but which also concentrated the risk of transmission for the other sleepers. Some accounts describe the isolation of plague victims within the household when the house was large enough to permit it, moving the sick person to a separate sleeping area, if one existed, or positioning them apart from the healthy family members. In the single-room Kruk house, this kind of separation was not physically possible, and the household either remained in close proximity to the sick or sent the healthier members to sleep in outbuildings. Water was a critical resource in the care of the sick. Fever required fluid replacement, and the maintenance of adequate hydration in a person with plague symptoms was one of the most important interventions available. The household that could provide clean, warm water, heated at the fire and given consistently to the sick person, was doing something measurably useful, even without understanding the physiological basis for its importance. The water carriers and well-maintainers of the village thus had a specific role in the medical economy of a plague winter, one that was not formally recognized, but that was practically significant. The death of a household member from plague required specific practical management that fell to the surviving family. The body needed to be prepared for burial, which involved washing and wrapping in a shroud, tasks that brought the preparer into direct contact with the clothing and bedding of the deceased, the most contaminated materials in the household. The records of secondary deaths within households in the days following an initial plague death are consistent with this exposure pathway. Those who prepared the body were among the most likely to contract the disease themselves. The medical landscape of the plague winter was thus one of profound limitation combined with practical improvisation. The formal medical knowledge of the period could not address the disease's cause. The informal knowledge of the household and the community addressed its symptoms with partial effectiveness. And the people who managed the sick, who sat beside them through the long winter nights, who brought water and maintained warmth, and said whatever prayers seemed available, did so with the understanding that they might be the next to need the same care from whoever remained to give it. The winter of the Black Death was not a silent event. People wrote about it, not universally, not in every village, but in sufficient quantity and with sufficient geographic distribution that the historical record preserves something of the experience from many angles and many voices. Chronicles, letters, medical treatises, administrative records, wills, and literary works produced in the decades surrounding the first outbreak constitute an archive of observation that is, by the standards of medieval documentation, unusually rich. The plague generated writing in a way that ordinary winters did not, because the plague was understood, even as it was happening, as something that needed to be recorded. The chronicle tradition of medieval Europe produced accounts of the plague from monastic scriptoria, from cathedral schools, and from the households of literate merchants and administrators. These accounts vary considerably in their character. Some are brief, a sentence or two noting that the plague had arrived in a given town, recording the approximate date and a rough estimate of mortality before continuing with the chronicle's primary concerns. Others are extended observations written by witnesses who were attempting to understand and document what they were experiencing as it happened. The Flemish chronicler Gilles de Mussy, abbot of the monastery of Saint-Martin in Tournai, was an old man when the plague arrived and wrote about it in terms that convey both the scale of the event and the difficulty of comprehending it. He described streets empty of their usual inhabitants, houses standing closed for weeks, the near cessation of commerce in a city that had been a major center of the wool trade. His account is valuable precisely because it was written from within the experience, without the retrospective organization that later historians could impose. Administrative records, the rolls of manors, the registers of cathedral chapters, the accounts of town governments provide a different kind of evidence. These documents were not written to preserve memory, but to manage property and obligation. And the plague appears in them as a disruption of those functions. Tenants recorded as dead, holdings noted as vacant, rents marked as uncollected. The accumulated effect of these notations across hundreds of surviving administrative documents has allowed modern historians to construct detailed regional pictures of mortality, economic disruption, and social reorganization that no single narrative source could provide. The will was a specific documentary form that the plague years produced in unprecedented volume. Wills were not common documents in the medieval peasant world. Most people had little enough property that formal bequests were unnecessary. But the Black Death generated a surge in will-making across social levels, as people confronted with the rapid progress of the disease attempted to arrange their affairs while they still could. These wills, preserved in diocesan archives and probate records, contain among the most direct surviving voices of ordinary people from the 14th century. The specific, bequests of a specific person, naming specific recipients, in a specific community, in a specific winter. The literary response to the plague produced works that outlasted their immediate context and became part of the European literary tradition. Boccaccio's Decameron, framed by a group of Florentines fleeing the plague to a country estate, used the epidemic as the mechanism for its narrative structure, while also containing in its frame narrative some of the most detailed surviving descriptions of the plague's social effects in a major city. Petrarch's letters, in which he described the loss of friends and the experience of living through successive waves of the disease, were widely read and widely copied in the decades following their composition. These literary works shaped the way subsequent generations understood the plague, and they also shaped what was preserved. The accounts that circulated widely, that were copied and translated and referenced by later writers, tended to be urban, literate, and male in their perspective. The experience of the rural household, of women managing the sick and the stored food and the children, of the peasant who could not write but who nonetheless lived through the same winters, is present in the historical record primarily through indirect evidence. The administrative documents, the archaeological record, the survival patterns visible in demographic data. The winter landscape itself was occasionally described in the Plague Chronicles, and these descriptions have a documentary value that goes beyond the literary. The chroniclers who noted that the plague was active in January in Scotland, or that February burial records in a Norwegian coastal town showed an unusual peak, were making observations that later epidemiologists would find significant. The plain, factual recording of when deaths occurred and in what numbers, performed by priests and scribes whose purpose was administrative rather than scientific, constitutes a kind of inadvertent data collection that has survived as evidence for the behavior of the disease across seasons and geographies. Memory of the plague winters was also preserved in the material culture of the period. The iconographic tradition that developed around plague imagery, the dance of death, the figure of death as a skeletal archer, the plague saints and their attributes, became part of the visual vocabulary of European art from the mid-14th century onward. Church walls were painted with images drawn from the plague experience. Devotional objects associated with plague protection were produced and distributed widely. The material evidence of this tradition, preserved in churches and museums, carries the memory of the plague winters in a form that was accessible to people who could not read. The writing and recording that the plague winters generated was thus not a single tradition, but a collection of overlapping practices, some formal and institutional, some literary, some administrative, some material, that together preserved something of what those winters were like for the people who lived through them. The gaps in this record are real and significant. Much of the experience of the most ordinary people is recoverable only in outline. But what survives is sufficient to reconstruct the essential shape of the plague winter: the closed houses, the banked fires, the depleted stores, the family in its shared bed, the bells ringing in the dark. With a fidelity that the passage of 7 centuries has not entirely erased,